Hey folks, thanks for tuning in to CCC today on the final Sunday of December and this final Sunday of 2024. I hope you had a fantastic Christmas earlier this week. We had a blast around Community Christian Church with all the candlelight Christmas services that took place. In fact, it was one of the highest attended services we've ever had in the history of our church as we gathered together to focus on the fact that God took all of his power and all of his presence and all of his majesty and he compacted it into one fragile, frail little human body. It's quite amazing how small God chose to make himself. But here on this final Sunday of December, I want us to spend a few minutes thinking about just how big God is. And to get at this, I want us to look at a particular guy's story in the Bible. And you've probably heard of this guy before. He has a book in the Bible that bears his name. And it's one of the oldest books in the Bible. And this guy's name was Job. Job was somebody who experienced the realities of this world in a pretty painful way. Let's think about Job for just a minute. And we don't know a whole lot about Job. Like we're told in the first chapter of Job that he was a blameless, upright man. And right at the beginning of the book of Job, we meet an angel who's rebelled against God. His name is Satan, which in Hebrew, the name Satan means the accuser. And Satan comes to God and says to God, hey, God, the only reason anybody worships you is self-interest. They serve you because you give them stuff. If they suffered, well, they'd give you up in a heartbeat. And God says, that's not true. Look at Job. Like you could take everything from Job and he'd still love me. And that's what happens. Satan takes everything from Job. Everything. Now, at this point in the book, we're saying like, hey, wait a minute. God shouldn't allow that to happen. Why would God allow that to happen? And we'd expect the rest of the book to answer that question. But it doesn't answer that question. Instead, what happens next is some of Job's friends show up. And they try to explain to Job why he's suffering. They say things like, Job, everything happens for a reason. So there's a reason for this. Think hard, Job. What is it? What did you do that caused this to happen? And Job says, I didn't do anything. And they say, you must have done something. And Job says, but I didn't. And they say, of course you did. You just got to remember what you did. What'd you do, Job? And Job says, I didn't do anything, guys. And that kind of thing goes on for 37 chapters until finally Job is like, guys, you're not helping. What you're saying is not helping at all. And that's when God shows up. Like God literally shows up. And Job's probably thinking, finally, I'm going to get some answers. But he doesn't. Instead of answering Job's questions, God asks Job some questions. God questions Job like a lot, an awful lot, a terribly awful lot. God asks Job 64 questions to be exact. You know, I'm not a morning person, never been a morning person, and at this point, I don't think I ever will be a morning person. And I tend to be pretty quiet in the mornings as I'm waking up and getting up. But I remember one time when I was in high school, and I sat down to eat a well-balanced breakfast consisting of a sleeve of Pop-Tarts before heading out to school, and my mom started asking me some questions. Tons of questions. Like, so many questions that I started to keep track of how many she was asking me. And in the time it took me to eat one Pop-Tart, my mom asked me 16 questions. Now, I don't know how long it took for God to ask Job 64 questions, like how many Pop-Tarts Job went through. But God rolls out 64 questions to him. 64 questions. And God asks Job things that Job couldn't really answer very well. Like, God says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? And Job probably said, I don't know, nowhere, I guess. And then God asked him, like, have you ever commanded the morning to appear and caused the dawn to rise in the east? To which Job probably said, no, definitely not. And God asked Job a whole lot of odd questions too, like, Job, do you know about the reproductive habits of goats? I'm not kidding about that. And he says, Job, do you know why ostriches are so ugly? I'm not kidding about that. And Job, how many chickens would it take to kill an elephant? Okay, that one I'm kidding about. He didn't ask him that. But he asks Job all these crazy questions Job couldn't possibly answer. And what God is trying to show Job is You have no idea how big I am, Job, and how small you are, and how much I know and how much you don't. So of course, Job, there are things that you don't understand. Job, you believe in me, you love me, but your version of me is not nearly big enough. I am way bigger and way better than you could imagine. And I think, gang, here at the end of 2024, that God would say the same thing to us. I think God would say to us, you believe in me, you love me, but your version of me is way too small. It was Tim Keller who wrote, the God who exists is not merely a God who is a little bit bigger than us. He is the God who is infinitely bigger than the entire universe. See, we need to realize and always keep in mind that God is way bigger and way better than we could possibly imagine. You know, throughout December, we've talked about all these aspects of God's character, like God is for us, and God is enough for us, and God is in us, and God is with us. And as we conclude this month and this year, we got to realize that God is so much bigger than us. He's way bigger and way better than we could possibly imagine. You know, it's amazing in the book of Job, we see how big God is and his absolute power over creation and angels and even Satan. Like we see that Satan can't act without God's permission. Like God had to allow Satan to cause Job to suffer. And the ultimate purpose of that was to bring glory to God. And I realize you might be saying, well, that's hard to live with, Dave. Like God might use my suffering just for his glory. And you're right about that. But understanding that is the secret to a happy, fulfilled life, that we exist for God's glory. That's how big God is. You exist for his glory. And when you realize that, well, it'll lead you to a joy you've never known and a peace that is almost unexplainable because it's what you were created for. It's the purpose of your life. And if you miss out on that, well, you'll never have a real sense of purpose, and you'll miss out on joy, and you'll miss out on peace. But when you supersize your perspective of God and live for his glory, understanding that, well, it changes everything. Now, that doesn't mean we'll understand everything God does. See, we got to understand that not only is God so big that he's all powerful, but he's also so big that he's all knowing. Like I think we realize God's power is greater than ours, but we kind of think our wisdom and our understanding and our perspective, well, it's about the same as his. So if we see a problem, well, we assume that God sees it the same way. But we know he has more power than us. So why isn't he handling it the way that we would? That's what we think. But God's thinking is not like ours. His perspective is not like ours. It's so much bigger and so much better. It's infinite. You know, a minute ago we thought about how much God has, how much power God has, how much higher his power is than ours. I mean, you can't even compare it. So think of it like this. God's wisdom and perspective is as bigger than mine as God's power is bigger than mine. Which means I struggle to think like God thinks. And you struggle to think like God thinks. We struggle to think like God thinks. You know, God says in the Bible, in the book of Isaiah, my thoughts are nothing like your thoughts, says the Lord. And my ways are far beyond anything you could imagine. For just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. And so the most rational conclusion is that there will be some things, there just will be some things beyond our ability to understand. Isn't it possible that God has a purpose, a beautiful purpose that he's working out in our lives that we just can't see fully yet? Like I've heard it said, God is doing about 10,000 things in your life right now, and you're aware of about 3 of them. See, we learn from the book of Job that God is big and his power and perspective are infinite. And we also see in Job that because God is so big, his purpose is guaranteed. Like one of the most encouraging things in the book of Job is that because God is all powerful and his perspective is infinite, even Satan's attempts to attack God's people only further God's purposes. I mean, think about this. Satan's attacks on Job produced a book that has encouraged people down through the centuries, perhaps more than any other book in the history of the world. Do you think that's what Satan had planned? No. Like, we see this kind of thing all throughout the Bible. And of course, the best example is the cross. When Jesus died, it was a Friday. And on that Friday, Satan thought that he had won. But you know what we now refer to that Friday as? Good Friday. God took the worst day and turned it into the best day. And listen, God can do the same thing with you and your life and your challenges and your struggles, whatever they are. I'll bet if you look carefully, you can probably already see some of the good that God is doing behind some of the bad things happening in your life. Like, when I hear people describe their struggles, they'll talk about so many good things that end up coming about because of the bad things that they're going through. And if we can already look back and see a good purpose for something bad that we've gone through, well, don't you think that given enough time and perspective, we'll see a reason for it all? God is so big that sometimes he uses the struggles and the challenges to shape us into the people that he meant for us to be. And we may not understand it always. We may not necessarily like it. We may have questions and doubts about it. But if we supersize our God, we'll be able to navigate through it all without crumbling. And we see that in Job. He questions God. He has some doubts, but he never loses his faith. He continues to love and trust God. And one of the greatest verses in the book of Job is found in the 19th chapter, the 25th verse, where Job says, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end, he will stand on the earth. He says, in the end, like, I'm still in the middle of the story. And every good story has some confusing and scary moments in it. So yeah, I don't like where I'm at right now, but in the end, this story can have a great ending, because this story is being written by a great God, a great, big, all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good God. Job is confident that in the end of his story, his Redeemer will come through for him. And he was right. That was exactly what happened. I wonder what he was thinking when he said that. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he'll stand on the earth. Because he didn't know what we know. He said, my Redeemer will stand on the earth. And he did. Jesus is that Redeemer. He's our Redeemer. And he came to earth and lived a human life so he could go to the cross and take the punishment for our sin so we wouldn't have to. He came to be wounded so we could be healed. He came to be separated from God so we'd never have to be separated from him again. And because Jesus came, I have the promise of God's presence with me. And I may not always understand fully what God's doing in my life at every single moment, particularly when it's difficult. But the cross shows me what my difficulties cannot mean. It cannot mean that God has lost control or lost his love for me. And as you look back on 2024, it may have been a fantastic year for you, or it may have been a really difficult and disappointing year for one reason or another. But I want to push us to realize just how big our God is. And I want to encourage you to build every square inch of your life on him. I'll bet you probably heard of Copernicus before, Nicholas Copernicus. Did you know that he turned the world upside down through astronomy? Yep, astronomy. Now, Nicholas Copernicus never intended to turn the world upside down through astronomy. He wasn't even a professional astronomer. But as he studied astronomy, which all of us do in our spare time, right? I mean, as he studied astronomy, something bothered him. Like, for centuries, astronomers have believed that the earth sat motionless at the center of the universe. Like the sun and the stars all revolved around the earth. I mean, it seemed obvious. We're the center of it all. But a few details didn't quite fit for Copernicus. Certain celestial bodies, they didn't always show up when they should. And the Greek and Roman astronomers assumed it was the result of, gods warring in the heavens. But Copernicus believed there was only one true God, and that God had set up the heavens in a very orderly fashion. So he started to imagine, like, maybe there was something else at the center. What if the sun was at the center? And he did some calculations, and it seemed to fit reality. So Copernicus, he ended up sending his findings to a publisher, and the publisher reluctantly put out a book with Copernicus' new theory. He printed 400 copies of it, but he couldn't sell any of them because it turned out people liked believing that the earth was the center of the universe. Later on, a few of Copernicus' students who realized that he was onto something, they began to write their own books, kind of further proving Copernicus was right. And scientists began to change their minds. In fact, the shift in thinking was so dramatic and so disorienting that historians labeled it the Copernican revolution. And it turned out it's a really good thing that the earth isn't the center of our solar system, because it's not big enough to have the gravity to keep all the other planets in orbit. Our sun does. That's why it's the center. And that's why it keeps everything else securely in orbit. And I know what you're thinking here. Who cares, Dave? What are you, Mr. Science? Did Santa bring you a science lab for Christmas or something? What in the world does this have to do with me? Well, I think it's a great metaphor, because our lives don't work when we make ourselves the center. Our lives just don't work when we make ourselves the center of our own little universe. Even if we make God one of the orbiting planets, which is what we tend to do, right? You make yourself bigger than you are and the center of your universe, and you make God smaller than he is. If you decide you want God in your life, well, you add him. He becomes part of your universe, like your family and your friends and your job and your hobbies. You plop God in there too, and they all kind of orbit around you. The problem is that we weren't designed to be at the center. We're not big enough. We're not God enough. And we can't keep everything in orbit. We don't have the gravitas to keep it all together. Our lives just don't work when we're at the center, even if we put God in our orbit. That's why so many people feel like life isn't working. Something's missing. They feel joyless or unfulfilled. And it's because they have something way too small at the center, which is themselves. What all of us needs is a sort of Copernican revolution for our souls, a spiritual revolution where we put God at the center of our lives. We will not thrive if we're at the center, because we're too small. And our lives will only work if the Lord of the universe is at the center. This past year at CCC, we had another record number of people take the step of baptism, which baptism is in part when a person says, okay, Lord, I invite you to take the primary place in my life, to be the center. I trust you and I believe in you. That just like you're big enough and wise enough and powerful enough to raise Jesus Christ from the grave, well, you can take center stage in my life now. And what happens is in baptism, people identify with the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the power of God on display in that way. We put together this little montage of most of the baptisms that took place around CCC this past year. I want you to check it out.
Come all you weary, come all you thirsty, come to the well that never runs dry. Drink of the water, come and thirst no more. Come all you sinners, come find his mercy. Come to the table, he will satisfy. Taste of his goodness, find what you're looking for. For God so loved the world that he gave us his one and only Son to save us. Whoever believes in him will live forever. Bring your addictions, come lay them down at the foot of the cross. Jesus is waiting there with open arms, oh, with open arms. For God so Jesus is waiting. God so loved the world.
That's a good way to wrap up our year around here at CCC. And listen, if you've never taken the step of baptism and identified with the heart of our faith and the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, I can't think of a better way to start the new year off than making God the center of your universe. And if you have taken that step before, but you've minimized the power and wisdom and love and working of God in your life, well, maybe it's time for a Copernican revolution of the soul as we turn the page to another year. And now, friends, may God do immeasurably more in your life than you could ever ask for or imagine, according to his power that's at work in the world and at work in us. And may he sanctify you through and through for your good and his glory. To him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen. Two things to let you know about. One is that we'll be back next Sunday with in-person services on the first Sunday of 2025, January 5th. And we got a special guest with us that day, so I hope to see you at 8:30, 9:45, or 11 a.m. on January 5th. And the second thing I want you to know is that I hope you have an absolutely fantastic and safe new year. Now, before we turn the page fully on Christmas season, I know some of you are still like analyzing and evaluating how your Christmas season went. And I want to help you with that. I mean, how do you know? How do you know how your Christmas season went? Well, I'm here to tell you how. Because Santa not only brought me a science kit, a Pez dispenser, and a Chia Pet, but he brought me a top 10 list too. And you know, the jolly old fat man wouldn't want me to keep all that Christmassy wisdom and fun to myself. It's the season to share. So I have right here the top 10 signs you had a bad Christmas season. These are the final words you're going to hear from me this year. The top 10 signs you had a bad Christmas season. All right, here we go. Number 10, every Christmas card you received was addressed to resident. Number 9, your cat ate all the tinsel and left you a special glittery present under the tree. Number 8, you have a cat. Number 7, your mom keeps making reindeer pot pie for dinner. Number 6, you're busted for running through the avenue wearing nothing but mistletoe. Again. Number 5, Santa ended up crashing into your drone somewhere over New Jersey. Number 4, your family Christmas tree was very small and said air freshener. Number 3, you woke up on Christmas Eve and found the head of an elf in your bed. Number 2, you celebrated Christmas in Pittsburgh. That's never good. And the number 1 sign you had a bad Christmas season, number 1, you keep coming up with lame top 10 lists. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll see you next year.